I am an archaeologist, and for many years I worked in countries like Turkey and Syria, Cyprus and Iraq. My research has been focused on the remote past, around 12,000 years ago, when people who had been hunter-gatherers for millions of years first began to settle down, living together in permanent communities of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. In recent years, as we began to hear more and more frightening news about the accelerating rate of global warming, I realized that the transformation of human life that I had been studying was also the beginning of the process that, from small beginnings, has led to the global climate crisis that we are now beginning to experience. At one level, it may be interesting to get a deeper perspective on the beginnings of the historical process that leads from distant prehistory in Southwest Asia, the Middle East, to our present. But it also makes sense to know where you've been coming from if you want to plan where you're going from here. And at another level, I think that we really need some of the social skills that were at the foundation of those first permanent communities of more than 10,000 years ago, and that enabled them to develop a new way of life, because that's what we've got to do. The first permanent communities began by building simple, single-roomed houses that were often semi-subterranean. Here we're looking down into an excavation trench at the excavation of two, or parts of two, subcircular semi-subterranean houses at the very bottom of the stratigraphy. This settlement was occupied for more than 1,000 years, and this is near the beginning of the settlement. At a number of the earliest permanent settlements, archaeologists have found that the community also had a large central building. This one, at a site beside the river Euphrates in North Syria, is 7 meters, about 24 feet across, and 3 meters below ground level. And it contained a set of huge storage bins in which the remains of barley and lentils were found. Its creation must have required a huge cooperative effort from the whole community, which probably numbered only around 150 people. Over time, populations grew and settlements became larger, with densely packed mud brick houses, like you can see in this picture. This is a settlement in the center of Turkey, dating around 7300 BC. And here is a cutaway of a house of that period, with its substantial living room and several storage rooms. These earliest communities began to cultivate crops of cereals. They had been harvesting the local wild wheat and barley, as well as the native wild lentils and chickpeas, for thousands of years, and now they began to experiment with cultivation. And they also began to domesticate the sheep and goat that they had formerly hunted. This is a map that reconstructs the habitat of wild goat. And this is a wild sheep, which looks to the non-expert very like a goat. Wild sheep lived in a similar habitat to the wild goat, as you can see. There were good reasons for hunter-gatherers to focus on these areas. It's the arc-shaped hill country stretching from Israel and Palestine, Jordan, up through West Syria, around through southeast Turkey, across the north of Iraq, and down the Iran frontier. That was the habitat of wild wheat and barley, wild pulses like lentils and chickpeas, and the habitat of wild sheep and goat. So that's why the first cultivation of cereals and legumes and the management of flocks of sheep and goat began around that same arc. And here we see with the rainfall, and it's the two medium blue zones, not the very palest and not the very darkest, where there was sufficient rainfall in the hill country to provide the kind of pasture for the animals and the kind of wild habitat for the wild cereals and wild legumes. The first permanently settled communities were very successful, and not just in terms of growing populations. Bringing many people to live and work together made them quicker to recognize and implement the benefits of small innovations. They used fire, for example, to produce the lime for making hard lime plasters for their floors. In some communities, they began to experiment with heat treating native copper, making neat little fish hooks and oars and needles. And somewhat later, they devised the skill of making and firing pottery. And that gave them storage vessels and cooking pots, as well as decorated tableware. They learned how to use the milk from their sheep and goats to make yogurt and cheese, and they devised ways to spin the hair from their sheep and their goats and weave the first woolen textiles. They were very successful, and their numbers grew and grew. As the population of a community grew from hundreds to thousands, and as the number of settlements began to fill the land, they had a profound impact on the natural environment. Once they had an agricultural package, however, of fully domesticated crops and animals, they were able to cope with population growth by budding off new communities who began to colonize new land in all directions. In this map, the first settlements and the first steps in cultivation are shown in that dark brown crescent dating from around 10,000, 9,000 BC. The map shows how farming communities expanded westwards to the western coast of Turkey by 7,000 BC, across the Aegean to the Greek mainland, across the Bosphorus and into the Balkans. Then 6,000, 5,000 BC, it spread right across to mainland Europe, and then you can see the expansion reaching into Britain and Ireland by around 4,000 BC. As they colonized new territory over the 3 millennia, they cleared forest, they changed the landscape, and eliminated local native species. You can see where I'm going. The things that we are worrying about now started a long time ago. We used to think of the arrival of farmers and the development of metallurgy and so on as progress. In short, they started the exponential growth of human population and the exponential exploitation of the natural world that leads up to the global crisis of today. Geologists and earth scientists are saying that we have changed the world to such an extent that it constitutes a new geological period, the Anthropocene, a new geological period marked by global changes for which we humans are responsible. Here, two leading scientists, writing in 2000, first proposed that the central role of mankind in geology and ecology justifies coining the term Anthropocene for the current geological epochs. Scientists may have only recently discovered the seriousness of what is happening, but we are now in a planetary crisis that has been a long time in the making. It would be easy to be carried away by the shocking news of catastrophic floods or the years of drought, the unparalleled extent of wildfires, and the record-breaking temperatures. The acceleration of human exploitation of the natural environment and its resources has been going on for thousands of years. And just as things are reaching critical levels, the rate of acceleration of global change is frightening the thousands of scientists who are researching all the components of the gathering storm. The graph shows sea surface temperatures for each year. The faint grey lines are the years between 1991 and 2020. The wavy line through the middle of those pale grey lines is the average for that period, 1991 to 2020. The pale blue wibbly line, a bit above that, shows the sea surface temperatures through 2023. And you can see how those temperatures, particularly for the second half of last year, were significantly higher than any previously known year. And the red line at the top shows the temperatures are even higher in the first months of 2024. We are the first generations of humans to discover what 12,000 years of human exploitation of environmental resources has done to the world, and we are learning of it as it reaches crisis points. There is no historical precedent to guide us as to how we can deal with this crisis. Where do we fit into this picture? Well, we know that the effects of climate change will affect us and everyone else in the world. We know that we are going to have to make great changes to our way of life in all sorts of ways. We could leave it to the United Nations bodies, the thousands of international scientists who contribute to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the annual COPs, the Conference of the Parties. That is where representatives of the world's governments meet to be updated by the IPCC scientists and decide what their response should be. Then they go home and decide to what extent they will adjust or reinforce their net zero plans. But look at this graphic that gives a timeline for the way governments develop their plans. Start at the top. where the IPCC scientists need 2 to 5 years to plan and get the funds and carry out the next stage of their research. And it takes the IPCC 2 years then to digest the vast amounts of new information and produce a watertight update of their report that will stand up against the probes of the deniers and the doubters. The second half of that timeline, years and years long, represents how each government's scientific advisors work with government ministers and their aides, working out just how and when the essential changes will be implemented. It takes too long, and there is no guarantee that government plans will be enough. Time is of the essence, and governments all over the world are showing that they are behind the curve. We know what is required. It can be summarized in 3 words, and the first word is mitigation, actions that reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions by shifting to renewable green electrical power, for example. We need to mitigate our impact on the environment through our concern for biodiversity and our efforts to contain carbon dioxide that can be fixed, for example, in trees and woodland. We have to rethink and change how we get around. We know that for our own health and well-being, we should take more exercise, and we need to rethink how we use public transport and our cars. At present, transport in general is responsible for a very significant amount of the total generation of carbon dioxide. The second of those words is adaptation, ensuring that our buildings are fitted out to cope with climate change, for example. We have to switch from gas and oil, hydrocarbons, that heat our buildings, which account for another very significant percentage of the total output of CO2 into the atmosphere. At the same time, adaptation offers us the potential to use less energy for our heating and to use green energy that is sustainably generated, in the end costing us less in our power bills. The third word is resilience, the capacity to anticipate and absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of climate change. We need resilient buildings and resilient transport, resilience in the supply chain that gets the foodstuffs to us. But we also need to be resilient communities, and investment now will pay off later. These first permanently settled communities were effective, highly resourceful, and resilient. They show us that the skills that we urgently need now have been inbred into our cultural DNA for 10,000 years. The scientists who study human evolution tell us that individually, humans are not the smartest animals on the planet. They're not the smartest primate, not even the smartest mammal. The success of those first settled communities was founded on their capacity for community spirit and cooperation. No one invented farming or pottery making or metallurgy. People worked together and shared small initiatives that accumulated into new solutions. As their heirs and successors, we need to relearn how to work together, capitalizing on those inherited skills of community, inventiveness, and cooperation.